It's funny that you bring up Velveeta. You know, if you look at some of these products like Velveeta or American cheese slices in the supermarket, these ultra-processed cheese-like products, many of them are not even legally allowed to call themselves cheese.
Welcome to the Spartan Up podcast, hosted by Joe De Sena, founder and CEO of Spartan Race, and brought to you by Wild Health.
We are talking about overcoming obstacles. The same way we teach people to get over obstacles on the course, we will teach you here on the Spartan Up podcast to get over obstacles in your mind.
Get race ready with Wild Health, the official healthcare provider of Spartan. Sign up at wildhealth.com with the code SPARTAN10 to save 10%. This episode of Spartan Up is brought to you by DUROLANE, a single injection that may provide up to 6 months relief from osteoarthritis knee pain. Risks can include general knee pain and pain at the injection site. You can see full prescribing information at DUROLANE.com.
Joe De Sena here, founder and CEO of Spartan and the Spartan Up podcast, where we attempt to rip you off the couch. I've got Max Lugavere. You've got a few books out. One was Genius Foods. This one is Genius Kitchen, and you've got a really unique way of looking at food. Tell us about it.
Yeah, thanks. By the way, it's an honor to be here, Joe. I love your accent, by the way. I've listened to a number of your the episodes in preparing for this interview. Yeah, so my perspective is, as a health and science journalist, I came to this topic of food and nutrition, well, actually quite organically, no pun intended. Early on, I was really interested in bodybuilding and fitness and nutrition. And I went through the pre-med track in college, but I ended up pivoting and started working in Hollywood as a journalist, which I did for 6 years back in the early aughts. It was a really great gig to get right out of college. I was on a TV channel that reached 100 million homes in the U.S., and it was there that I got to sort of hone my investigative and storytelling chops. But the reason why I turned to food and nutrition as my full-time purpose and passion in life was because in around the year 2011, my mother started to display the earliest symptoms of what would ultimately be diagnosed as a form of dementia. And I come from a very small family, grew up in New York City. I'm the oldest of 3 boys, and I was always incredibly close with my mother. And when she started to show these symptoms, I was in between jobs, actually, and I took it upon myself to go with her to become her patient wingman to doctors' offices to try to discover what was going on with her cognition and her movement. She presented at the same time with strange movement symptoms. And we went from doctor's office to doctor's office, and in every instance, I experienced what I've come to call diagnose and adios. We were met with a slew of esoteric tests, and then in most cases, a doctor would just write a couple prescriptions on the prescription pad in, that barely legible handwriting that doctors always use, and send us on our way. And it wasn't until we decided to take a trip to the Cleveland Clinic where my mom was diagnosed with a neurodegenerative condition for the first time. And it was there that she was prescribed drugs actually for both Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. And that was like a atomic bomb going off in my universe, Joe. And from that point forward, I was essentially unable to focus on anything other than trying to understand why this would have happened to a woman at her age. She was young. She was 58 at the time. What could be done, if anything, to help her, from the standpoint of disease modification, and what, in tandem with that, could be done to prevent this from ever happening to myself, because, I now, for the first time, had a risk factor for neurodegeneration. And one of the most startling discoveries that I made is that dementia often, especially when talking about Alzheimer's, which is the most common form of dementia, it's not what my mother had, just to be clear, but it's the most common form of dementia, begins in the brain decades before the first symptom of memory loss. And Parkinson's disease, too. By the time you show up to your neurologist's office with your first symptom, this is a decades-long disease process that is already in motion. So I was like, well, if you take 30 years from my mom's age, you get me. And I realized very early on that this is something that I needed to focus on, that I needed to roll up my sleeves and really, put my head down and do the work and understand all of the various lifestyle factors, dietary factors, everything that I possibly could about nutrition and the brain. And that's what led to the writing of my first book, Genius Foods, which is a nutritional care manual for the human brain, essentially. And what I'm doing in the new book, Genius Kitchen, is I'm making it all practical. So it's basically like, how do I take everything that I've learned about nutrition and distill them and really transform them into delicious, easy to create, low cost meals.
How many years ago was that?
My mother first started to show her symptoms in 2011. She was 58. And unfortunately, she passed away.
Oh, she passed away. Sorry.
Yeah. She passed away 3 years ago.
And it was due to what you found in 2011?
No, actually. I mean, it's really quite tragic. My mother's health was, she had very poor luck when it came to health. So she had this form of dementia, which my family struggled with for 8 years. And then August of 2018, she, it's a short story, but she turned yellow. She developed jaundice, and we took her to the emergency room at that time. And her cognition had severely declined at that point. Her movement had severely declined. And usually what happens when somebody has jaundice is they have a gallstone. But to rule out other more severe conditions, what they do is they perform an MRI on the abdomen. And what they found in my mother's case was not a gallstone, but a tumor on the head of her pancreas that was pressing into her bile duct. And so she had pancreatic cancer. And it was just the most brutal, tragic, awful 3 months of my life. And so, you know, when you have anybody who's listening to this who's ever had a sick loved one knows that it reorients your priorities real quick. And so that's why I've just become obsessed with living healthily and learning everything that I could about disease prevention, disease risk mitigation.
I spent 6 months with my mom as she deteriorated and died. So I get it. And when I was very young, she talked to me about her mom, who she spent a bunch of time with, who deteriorated and died. And I watched it happen to my dad. And so I loved your sentence about you get reprioritized really quick. And so when people ask me like why I'm always like so happy and so motivated, it's like, because I really understand the value of today. Like, it's really valuable to, like, I might not have tomorrow.
Right.
Have you connected with Huberman and Jim Quick? Like, anybody that's talking about the brain, you should be the food guy.
Yeah, my focus was really the science of nutrition and lifestyle factors. And under the purview of brain health, you have cardiovascular health, you have metabolic health, you have fitness. So the science of cognitive optimization from the standpoint through the lens of nutrition and fitness is really sort of my focus. And what I attempted to become as I was going to all these different doctors' offices with my mother was to inform myself as best as possible, to become, in a sense, a walking meta-analysis for all the latest research on what it means to live a long time and to live with a long health span. Not just a long lifespan, but a long health span. My mother didn't have either. She didn't have a long lifespan. She didn't have a long health span. And so I want those two things, and I want those two things for the other people in my life that I care about. And people generally, I think that this is something that having a long and healthy life is a privilege afforded to the few today, unfortunately. And I think that it's our birthright to live long and healthfully. But we have so many obfuscating factors today, whether it's nutritional misinformation or, you know, we could go even further and say the extreme corners of the healthy at any size movement, the anti-diet culture that's out there. You know, I think that there are some positive aspects to both of those movements, but from the standpoint of health, you know, for me, it's really important to help people understand the difference between fact and fiction, because my mother was a victim to nutritional misinformation. Just
to assume that because it's on TV or because politicians or doctors or whatever say it, so like, I don't know if you remember, you're probably too young, but I remember when there were guys in lab coats with stethoscopes saying 9 out of 10 doctors recommend smoking Marlboro cigarettes.
That's crazy to me.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So 9 out of 10 doctors smoking cigarettes, right? And so when I married my wife, my in-laws, who might as well be, you wouldn't know this phrase, leave it to Beaver, but that was like perfect family show back in the 50s or 60s. My in-laws are perfect, but yet they thought Velveeta cheese was okay, right? Because it's sold in the supermarket and the FDA, it must be okay. and that's the problem, is people just assume that if it's being sold and it's being marketed, that it's okay. So what did she fall prey to that as well?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's funny that you bring up Velveeta. You know, if you look at some of these products like Velveeta or American cheese slices in the supermarket, these ultra processed cheese-like products, many of them are not even legally allowed to call themselves cheese. Like if you look at, a package of what you think is called American cheese, they're actually called American slices. And Velveeta is a spread. It's not actually cheese. It's just, it's Frankenfood at the end of the day. And those are the kinds of foods that I grew up on. My mother, she was very health conscious. I grew up very privileged. I'm just going to, lay that out. I grew up in New York City. Okay. So I had access to all the best food in the world growing up in a major metropolitan area like New York City. And my mother was health conscious. She thought that she had family history of heart disease. Whether or not that's true, I didn't know my relatives super well. My grandfather had passed away when I was very young. He could have passed away from the same thing that my mother passed away from, for all I know. So what is in my family tree is not exactly clear to me. But because she believed that we had heart disease in our family lineage, she was always very attuned to what the food industry and what the media said about how to avoid heart disease, which, Joe, for the past few decades was avoid fat, particularly saturated fat, and avoid dietary cholesterol, right? And she didn't have the internet. She was not tech savvy in any sense. So even at the dawn of the internet in the 90s, my mom wasn't on it. So she was only receptive to what the media said and what her physicians, who are not nutrition experts, but for somebody of her generation, you expect a physician to know everything about health, right? And she didn't have the internet. So if she was walking through the supermarket and she saw a product with a big red Heart Healthy logo on it, she assumed that was going to be beneficial to cardiovascular health. And because cholesterol was bad, she avoided foods with cholesterol in it. So I never saw my mom, and I'm not... Joe, I'm not being hyperbolic in any sense. I never growing up, I can't remember once seeing my mother eat an egg. I was about 12 years old when she gave me my first scramble for the first time, and she told me to eat it in strict moderation because the cholesterol in the yolks would clog my little 12-year-old heart, 12-year-old arteries at the time. My mother never ate any red meat. She was also a big animal rights advocate, and I loved my mother to death. So I'm not, patronizing her values here. Her values were very important to her, but this is sort of like in the N of one observational case study for me, looking back on my mom's life and how she lived and what she ate. She avoided dietary cholesterol. She ate a very low saturated fat diet. But if there were products that were marketed as being heart healthy, she went to town on them. So she always, ate oatmeal in the mornings. She went through refined grain products, like they were good for her essentially because they had marketing messaging like low salt, low sodium, low fat, cholesterol free on them.
Our moms were the same. I mean, my mom, I remember having wheat germ sandwiches.
Yeah. And I grew up eating margarine. I grew up eating margarine instead of butter. Yeah. In fact, I remember preferring the taste of margarine. I certainly preferred the texture. It was more spreadable than butter, which my mom kept in the fridge. The butter was always like really hard, and the margarine was like this very easy to spread amalgamation of trans fats. And
I guess my question before we get into like the perfect diet, I'd like to know, like for the listeners out there, the folks watching, and I'm sure you've said this 1,000 times, like shouldn't we should question authority, not to the point where we march to the Capitol, but like we should at least do some research, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm a big fan of questioning authority. I think it's super important. I mean, because if you don't, who's going to? That's why I think this new era that we're in with podcasting, and this is like a different topic, but that's why I think podcasts like yours, what I try to do on my podcast, The Genius Life. It really is so important because it allows us to have these long form conversations with dissenting viewpoints that aren't being heard, aren't being platformed on mainstream media. And so, not all of those voices are necessarily the kinds of voices that you want to live according to, but I think it's important to have a plurality of voices. I think that's what's so great about podcasting, is that it allows for a plurality of voices so that you, the hopefully discerning viewer who has the ability to think critically, can create sort of an idea soup in your brain, in the marketplace of ideas, determine what's going to be best for you and your family.
I love idea soup. I didn't know I was allergic to gluten. I didn't know I had a gluten problem. And I grew up in an Italian neighborhood where we ate a lot of gluten. And I was probably late 30s, 40 years old. And I remember somebody telling me, which, from the idea soup, what they were going through. And when I removed it, it was like changed my life. Had I just known, 20 years before that, like, it would have just been game changing. So you're right. Thank God for these conversations. What's the perfect diet in your mind? What's the perfect diet look like to be incredibly sharp and hopefully a long health span?
Over the years, I've tried to come up with like the perfect way to put it. And at this stage, I don't know if it's the perfect way to put it, but I really believe that a diet that incorporates properly raised animal products and whole plants is really ideal. I think that you can't go too far into either extreme, whether we're talking about a full-on carnivore diet or full-on veganism. I think that the diet that I think is most optimal is probably carnivore adjacent, but it's not necessarily, if you were to go onto the for example, Instagram pages of some of the more prominent carnivores, it's not necessarily a red meat heavy diet, although it can be. I think red meat is one of the most nutrient dense foods that we have access to. But I think, it really, wild fatty fish is one of the best foods that you can give your brain from the standpoint of evidence as well. I mean, we can argue about red meat. There's certainly lots of evidence that I can cite that suggests that red meat is highly beneficial to the brain. But when it comes to randomized controlled trials, observational studies, people that eat more fish tend to be the most protected. And it's not even a lot of fish that you have to eat. It's about 1 to 2 servings a week, even for people who are genetically at risk for cognitive decline and cardiovascular disease, carriers of the ApoE4 allele, which is the most well-defined Alzheimer's risk gene. Fatty fish seems to be almost like medicine.
And do we run a risk? I lived up in Vancouver for a year. I had some of the best fish I've ever had up there. And my buddy was one of the biggest fish processors in the world in Vancouver. And do we run a risk that, the oceans are a little messy these days? Or like, how do you handle that farm-raised fish?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad you brought it up because though I said wild fish, I think that whatever fish you have access to is going to be beneficial because the observational studies on on risk, people tend not to eat wild fish, right? So at the population level, people tend not to eat wild fish. They tend to eat actually mostly canned fish. Now, I'm not endorsing necessarily going out and basing your diet around canned tuna. But the quality of fish that is most often consumed isn't even that great, and it still seems to provide a protective effect. There have been studies that have looked at mercury content in the brain, which correlates with the degree of mercury that people consume, right? But the benefits still outweigh the risks in terms of what these food products do for our cognition.
There's a Norwegian fish oil I stumbled upon at Whole Foods one day. I'm not taking enough. Any good? Not good?
I think you're talking about Nordic Naturals.
I think so.
Yeah. So I personally take that brand. And in full disclosure, they have in the past sponsored my podcast. But even before that, even before I had a commercial financial relationship with them, I was a huge fan of their products. First of all, I like the way they taste, which is an important subjective indicator of how fresh your fish oil is. It should taste good. It shouldn't taste fishy. if you notice when you go to the supermarket, the fish section doesn't smell fishy. It doesn't smell like if you were walking through, for example, in New York City, the seaport, because it's only old rancid fish that has that notorious fish smell, and that's due to the breakdown of TMA to TMAO, which is a compound in fish that gives it that terrible fishy smell. So fresh fish shouldn't smell, it shouldn't taste fishy. And so that's one trick that your listeners can use to know whether or not their fish oil is of high quality. Sometimes I just bite down on the pills, and I taste it. So Nordic Naturals, I'm a fan of. It's not the only good fish oil out there. There are other fish oils that are IFOS certified. I think IFOS is a great thing to look for on your fish oil. It's the International Fish Oil Standards group, and they do third-party independent testing. They look for they look specifically at oxidation and byproducts of oxidation in the fish oil, and also heavy metal testing and stuff like that. Good sort of way to know that the fish oil that you're getting is quality.
So let's eat wild fish. Let's take some good quality fish oil. We should eat. I have a farm in Vermont, and anybody listening or watching, it's incredibly hard to run a farm. And you could easily see how factory farming came into effect, because to let the animals run wild, like, it's hard work, and you don't make a lot of money. The fastest way to become a millionaire with a farm is to start with 10 million. You lose 9 pretty quickly. Like, it's rugged. And so as long as it's farm raised, farm grazed, you're okay with the meat. Is any meat better than others? You like poultry? You don't like poultry?
We'll be right back to this episode, but first a quick word from our partner, Wild Health. You want to live like a Spartan, whether you're on the course or off. Take control of your health with Wild Health. They're the official healthcare provider for Spartan. They use DNA, blood work, your lifestyle, and so much more so that you can get truly personalized healthcare. Healthcare focused on performance. You'll learn about optimal diet, about exercise, sleep routines, and how to prevent chronic disease with your personalized 50-page health report. Maximize your energy, optimize your nutrition, and improve your performance. Sign up at wildhealth.com with the code Spartan10 to save 10%. You know that knee pain can really slow you down. Sometimes that knee pain is due to osteoarthritis, a disease that affects some 14 million Americans. Learn about osteoarthritis knee pain and how to alleviate it at oakneepainrelief.com. You'll find information there about non-surgical, non-opioid treatments for osteoarthritis knee pain that may help delay the need for knee surgery. One treatment you'll find there is DUROLANE, a single injection that may provide up to 6 months of relief from osteoarthritis knee pain. It's indicated for the treatment of mild to moderate osteoarthritis knee pain when conservative treatments have not worked. Risks can include general knee pain and pain at the injection site. Full prescribing information is at DUROLANE.com. Spartans say no to limits. You can learn more at oakneepainrelief.com. That's oakneepainrelief.com.
I think that red meat is more nutrient dense than poultry. It's got heme iron. Iron is very important. Anemia affects a huge population in the world. 1 in 4 people globally are anemic, and iron deficiency anemia accounts for half of those cases. So many people still need to get iron, and the most bioavailable source of iron, without question, is from red meat. It's also the most accessible. Premenopausal women, super important. It also is a wonderful source of vitamin E, which is important for protecting fatty structures in the body. It's the most important fat-soluble antioxidant that we have to regularly ingest. It's a great source of creatine, which, Joe, is well studied for its ability to support physical performance, but it also supports cognitive performance. There have been a number of studies that have shown that supplemental creatine can boost cognition. There was one study that showed in particular that when vegans and vegetarians supplement with creatine, they see an improvement in their cognitive function. So really important for the brain. We synthesize creatine in our own bodies. We are red meat at the end of the day. So we are a source of creatine endogenously. But But studies do show that when we get more from our diets, it seems to support good cognitive function. It's also it's a small source, but a significant source nonetheless of omega-3 fatty acids. And also, when you get your meat from a grass-fed cow as opposed to a grain-fed cow, you're seeing a lot lower, a smaller concentration of omega-6 fats, which we all get plenty of from our diets anyway these days. And you see less saturated fat. Now, there's been, as the pendulum has swung to being out of the dogma of the low fat era of the past, we now see a lot of people that are that basically endorse chasing saturated fat as if it's a nutrient that we need. And I'm not anti-saturated fat in any sense, but I do think that there's still a significant portion of the population that I think that the fact that a properly raised cow has a lower proportion of saturated fat than an improperly raised cow, to me, signifies to some degree, it indicates the ratios that are perhaps biologically appropriate for us to consume. I don't think that excessive amounts of saturated fat are good for us, and I certainly don't think that excessive, and the key word here is excessive, is good for the population of carriers of the ApoE4 allele, which are 1 in 4 people who are genetically more prone to developing Alzheimer's disease. They seem to have a more overt response to consuming lots of saturated fats in the diet. And we could even break down saturated fats. Not all saturated fats are created equally. You have myristic, palmitic, stearic acid, lauric acid. Stearic acid is actually quite benign. It's the saturated fat that's found predominantly in dark chocolate. And you also find it in significant amounts in beef. But some saturated fats in certain populations will actually cause a significant increase in LDL cholesterol, which, I would not, were I a doctor, I wouldn't treat a single number, but I still think it's worth being sort of cognizant of as we make our choices when it comes to food.
Let's switch over to veggies. Give me the top 3 vegetables we should be eating.
Oh man, I love this question. So yeah, I'm pro veggie. I love meat. I also love vegetables, and I think when it comes to brain health, cardiovascular health, I think it's really hard to overlook avocados. Avocados are great. They're very high in monounsaturated fat, which is super healthy fat for all populations, no matter your genes. Monounsaturated fat, it's a great dietary fat, really friendly from the standpoint of cardiovascular health. It's also a rich source of vitamin E, which, as I mentioned, vitamin E's job is to protect fatty structures in the body, and your brain is comprised primarily of fat. So this is a compound that we really want to try to look for foods that are high in vitamin E. Vitamin E consumption is associated with reduced risk for cognitive decline, also great for cardiovascular health. Avocados are rich in that. Avocados are also a great source of carotenoids. So carotenoids are compounds, they're plant pigments that were originally identified for being beneficial to eye health. But because our eyes are a projection of our brains, and eyes actually contain neural tissue, we now know that carotenoids are also highly beneficial from the standpoint of brain health as well as brain performance. And 2 carotenoids in particular, lutein and zeaxanthin, are found in high amounts in avocados. And the catch-22 with these compounds is that they need fat to be absorbed. But with an avocado, you get an abundance of fat. So they really do a great job of enriching the brain with protector molecules that help the brain age better and enhance its functioning even day to day.
Sounds like the perfect food for you is like an avocado salmon roll.
It really is. Yeah, it really is. That is one of my favorite foods, Joe. Avocados are great. I mean, the one thing that I would say about them is that they're pretty dense with fat. So if you're on a calorie counting diet for whatever reason, if you're trying to if you're on a weight loss plan, you don't have to eat the whole avocado in one sitting. You can eat half an avocado or a quarter of an avocado. All that is to say that they're a wonderful brain food.
Give me 2 more veggies.
Yeah, I love dark leafy greens. I'm a big fan of having a big salad every day. When I say big, for me, I mean 1 to 2 cups. Researchers out of Rush University have shown us that people who adopt this dietary habit have brains that perform and look on brain scans up to 11 years younger. You could potentially attribute that to healthy user bias. People who are eating salads every day, probably doing other healthy things. But we know that dark leafy greens are a great source of, well, depending on the green, you can look to kale, which I know I'm going to get some flack for this, but I actually am a fan of kale. I think it is the top source of those two carotenoids that I was talking about, lutein and zeaxanthin. A tremendous source of these two carotenoids, which is what gives kale that rich, dark color that kale is characteristic of. So, either whether we're talking about kale or arugula, which is the top source per calorie of dietary nitrates, which when you chew helps create nitric oxide in our blood vessels, which increases blood flow to our brain, to our distal organs, helps boost insulin sensitivity, blood flow, as I mentioned. Super, super beneficial. One high nitrate meal could potentially boost your cognitive function. It's that powerful. So I'm a huge fan of arugula. Spinach is a great source of folate. All these, dark leafy greens have negative aspects to them. If you had a carnivore on the podcast, I'm sure they would say, well, spinach has oxalates and kale, can harbor thallium, right? Like there's a cost-benefit analysis. There's a cost-benefit analysis that you could do for every food. And so I think it's really important when eating whole foods to realize that generally the benefits are going to outweigh the risks for most people.
I was in a race going across Alaska once. I was in waist-deep snow. And don't ask me why. I had a bag of carrots in my pocket. Carrots any good? They tasted good out there. I was pretty hungry.
Yeah, carrots are great. I mean, they're a great source of beta-carotene, which is another carotenoid, which has been shown to boost brain health, eye health. Anything that's good for your eyes is good for your brain, and vice versa.
So I just to make sure I don't get it, because I got a lot of information from my mom and then doing the podcast, but what I like, here's my perfect day, and please beat it up. Like, don't worry that you're on the podcast. Like you could say that's terrible. I like if I had my own personal chef and I didn't have to work as hard as I do and everything was perfect, right? I'd have a big green salad in the morning with a couple of eggs over easy. That would be my breakfast. Lunch, I would have a big salad with avocado and nuts or whatever. And at night, I'd have veggies and maybe a little bit of rice and fish.
I think that sounds amazing. And I'm down with rice. I eat rice occasionally. I'll eat it with
I'd have a little bit because I want it. I'm not saying I need it. It's just like a cheat for me.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. You and I and many of your listeners are probably spend a lot of time in the gym. And, for somebody who's working out vigorously, you need carbohydrates. I'm not, one of these anti-carb kind of guys, although I can talk at length about the potential benefits of a ketogenic diet for somebody with neurological conditions or a neurological condition or even symptoms. But I do think that from the standpoint of physical performance, it's pretty cut and dry at this point that carbohydrates are a performance-enhancing tool to be utilized. But I think your diet, I think that sounds great. I mean, it sounds highly nutrient dense. At the end of the day, if you're minimizing your consumption of ultra-processed, shelf-stable, packaged processed foods, you're doing better than 99% of people out there anyway. I mean, your average adult today, 60% of their calories come from ultra-processed foods, and yours sounds like, it sounds like in your diet, those kinds of foods take a pretty minimal role.
Last question for you, unless I missed something and we can go into it. But my boys found a wrestling program. My daughters have a soccer program that's incredible. And we got to get up at like 5:30 in the morning, and they got to go to pretty heavy duty practice every morning. And I found Bob's Red Mill oatmeal in a cup that has flax seeds and chia seeds in it. And you pour hot water in it, and it takes like 2 minutes on the way out the door. Good, bad? What do you think?
I think that's totally. I mean, I think that can be great so long as. I mean, you didn't mention a protein source.
No, I don't have a protein source in there. I've been trying to convince them. I got some healthy protein powder. I was going to put a spoon in, but they're not buying it.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably. There have been studies, and I'm drawing a blank on the specific ones, but I believe that it's pretty well observed at this point that starting the day with like mostly carbohydrates leads to hunger later on.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah.
Yeah. So if it's working for you, then I would say stick with it. But for somebody out there who's trying to architect the perfect breakfast, for me that would be, it's a little light in terms of the healthy fats, and it's a little bit light in terms of the protein.
I threw some coconut oil in there. I didn't tell you that. Any good?
Well, then you're just having like a carb and fat bomb, and coconut oil to me is not the most healthful oil. I think coconut oil there's a lot of sort of confusion about it. First of all, it's very nutrient poor. There are no essential nutrients in coconut oil. It doesn't provide protein it's an oil, so obviously it wouldn't provide protein. But I would say
you'd rather have an avocado in there?
I'd rather have like a piece of avocado. It's more nutrient dense for the fat content.
Maybe a little bit of eggs?
Definitely some eggs. I would slam a protein shake if I were you. Try to get at least 2.5 grams of leucine, bolus of leucine to hit that leucine threshold in the morning. But here's the thing: I'm not anti oatmeal necessarily, although I personally don't eat it. But I think that everything that the flax seeds and the chia seeds, great source of gel forming viscous fiber, which is really good for lipid metabolism. I'm a fan. Also, oatmeal has beta glucans in it, which really good for immune function and stuff like that. So I wouldn't necessarily give your breakfast an A, but I think that with a few tweaks, like adding a good protein source, maybe swapping out the coconut oil and throwing in a piece of avocado, or
it's good. It's good because this has only been 3 days since I got to Florida, so there's time to pivot.
Yeah, I wouldn't even add any extra oil necessarily. I would eat like I would keep the oil out, because oil is it's not satiating, it's not nutrient dense, highly calorically dense. I would save the oil for my salads and use extra virgin olive oil, which is the most sort of evidence-based oil that boosts metabolic health, brain health, cardiovascular health. I would cut the coconut oil out unless you have a specific reason that you're using it. So some people use coconut oil for the MCTs for various reasons. That's sort of another rabbit hole to go down. But I would cut the oil out and I would add a protein source, like a quick protein shake or
consider
2 eggs. Yeah.
Starting tomorrow, the kids get it a different way. All right. How do they find you? How do people find you?
Yeah, so definitely check out my new book, Genius Kitchen. Tons of information, as well as over 100 easy-to-make recipes at geniuskitchenbook.com. I have my own podcast. It's called The Genius Life, and I'm very active on Instagram at Max Lugavere, and it's spelled MaxLugavere.
Well, you're awesome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Joe.
If you're ever in Florida, you remember, hit me up.
Do you know someone who needs a little help staying motivated, staying informed, getting or staying mentally and physically resilient? We're here 3 days every week with a mix of content to help you stay strong, from mindset to nutrition and everything in between. Listen every Tuesday to hear Joe De Sena, Spartan Race founder and CEO. And the rest of the week, join us for DECA, Endurance, and Classic episodes. See you next time. Get race ready with Wild Health, the official healthcare provider of Spartan. Sign up at wildhealth.com with the code SPARTAN10 to save 10%. This episode of Spartan Up is brought to you by DUROLANE, a single injection that may provide up to 6 months relief from osteoarthritis knee pain. Risks can include general knee pain and pain at the injection site. You can see full prescribing information at DUROLANE.com.